Johnny Carson leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. It was 1982. The guest sitting across from him was Frank Sinatra's old friend, a comedian named Danny, someone who'd been in the game long enough to know how it worked. You smiled, you told your story, you got your laughs, you left. But Danny had just said something that made Johnny's entire face go still. I lost my kid yesterday. Quel accident. He was 7. The words hung there, not in a confessional way. Danny said it like he was reading a grocery list, like his voice had already learned to deliver devastating news without inflection, because if he used any emotion at all, it would kill him on live television. The audience didn't know what to do. The band didn't play. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Johnny's producers were probably panicking in the control room. This wasn't the format. You didn't bring death onto the Tonight Show. You brought entertainment. You brought escape. You brought people who wanted to talk about their new movie, their funny story, their clever bit. But Johnny did something that would haunt television for decades. He stood up, not slowly, not for effect. He just stood up, walked around that desk, and he sat down next to Danny, not in another chair, right next to him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Tell me about him, Johnny said. Danny's jaw clenched. His eyes got wet, but his voice didn't shake. It never shook. His name was Michael. He liked dinosaurs. He was terrible at math, but he was funny, you know? He'd make jokes, and they didn't really make sense, but somehow they made you laugh anyway. He wanted to be a mailman because he thought mailmen were superheroes. Johnny reached over and took Danny's hand. Not a pat on the back. He held his hand like they were old friends who'd just gotten the worst news of their lives together. A mailman, Johnny repeated quietly, because they brought good news to people. Yeah, Danny said, and his voice finally cracked. He wanted to bring good news. For the next 47 minutes, there were no jokes, no segues, no commercial breaks that Johnny tried to ease into. There was just a man whose son had died talking about his son to another man who was choosing to listen like nothing else in the world mattered. Danny talked about Michael's laugh, the specific way he laughed at cartoons, how he'd wake up at 5 in the morning on Saturday just to watch them. He talked about how his ex-wife had called him, how he'd driven to the hospital, how the doctor had already known before he got there. He talked about the funeral arrangements, about picking out a tiny coffin, about the impossibility of the world continuing to turn when your child wasn't in it anymore. And Johnny didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say it would get better, or that God had a plan, or any of the 1,000 useless things people say to the grieving. He just sat there, present, witnessing. The television audience was experiencing something unprecedented. They were watching a man's grief in real time, unfiltered, unprepared, raw. Some people turned it off. Others called NBC to complain. But millions of others stayed. They stayed because they were watching something real. When Danny finally stopped talking, when he seemed to run out of words, Johnny did something that nobody expected and nobody could explain. He took off his wedding ring. Not dramatically. He simply slipped it off his finger and placed it in Danny's hand. I've been married 33 years, Johnny said. I have 4 kids. I can't imagine losing one of them. I can't imagine the weight you're carrying right now. I don't know if this means anything, but I want you to know that someone sees what you're going through. I see it. The ring was simple, gold, worn smooth from decades of wear. It wasn't expensive or precious in a monetary sense. But everyone in that studio understood it meant everything. Danny closed his fist around it. His shoulders shook. For the first time all night, he cried. Not controlled tears. He sobbed. And Johnny held him while America watched. When they went to commercial, the cameramen had tears on their faces. The band members weren't looking at their instruments. They were looking at 2 men sitting together in the wreckage of one man's world. After the taping ended, after the audience filed out, Johnny gave Danny his private number. He told him to call anytime. 3 in the morning. Doesn't matter. He meant it. Danny called. Not that night, but a week later, then a month later, then just randomly for the next 15 years until Danny died of a heart attack at 59. Some people thought the grief took him. Johnny thought the grief had been taking him ever since that car accident, and his heart just finally gave up the fight. What nobody saw was what happened the weeks after that episode aired. The Tonight Show received more mail than any single episode in its history. Over 40,000 letters. Not fan mail. Grief mail. Parents who'd lost children. Grandparents who'd lost grandchildren. Siblings who'd lost siblings. People who'd been carrying their grief alone, convinced they were the only ones who understood this particular flavor of devastation. They were writing to say thank you. Not to Johnny. To Danny. They were writing to say we see you, and we're here, and you're not alone. One letter came from a woman in Minnesota who'd lost her daughter 5 years earlier. She wrote, "I've cried alone every day for 5 years. Last night, for the first time, I cried with someone. I watched your interview, and I cried the entire time. And this morning, something shifted. I'm still grieving, but I'm not grieving alone anymore. Thank you for being brave enough to break in front of everyone." Johnny kept that letter on his desk for the rest of his life. But here's what makes this story transcend a simple moment of television history. Danny's wife, the one he divorced when Michael was 3, saw that episode. She'd been watching from her living room in Arizona with her new husband and their 2 kids. And she called Danny the next morning. She told him she was sorry. Not just for the accident. For everything. For the divorce. For keeping his relationship with Michael to weekends. For all the ways she'd made his grief more complicated by making it also about losing his son twice. Danny didn't know what to say. So he said nothing. He just listened. She asked him to come visit. She wanted him to know her new children. She wanted to talk about Michael, to tell stories, to let her new family understand what her first son had meant to her and to Danny. Danny went. He brought the wedding ring Johnny had given him. He showed it to her. He told her the story. And for the first time since Michael's death, Danny was no longer carrying his grief in complete isolation. His ex-wife was carrying it with him. Her new husband was witnessing it. Her new children, Michael's half-siblings, would grow up knowing their brother through the stories. The funeral had been a solitary event. But that one moment on The Tonight Show, that radical act of presence, had broken open something that grief had sealed shut. It had let other people in. Johnny never talked about this follow-up publicly. He didn't mention it in interviews. He didn't use it as a story. He just knew that what he'd done had mattered in ways that extended far beyond that single night. In his later years, when people asked Johnny Carson what he was most proud of from his career, he'd often mention this episode. Not because of his performance, because of what happened when he stopped performing. He'd say, "You spend your whole career trying to make people laugh. And then you realize that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone not be alone in their pain." That's real television. That's not entertainment. That's witnessing. When Johnny died, Danny wrote a eulogy that was published in the Times. He talked about the ring. He talked about that night. He said, "Johnny Carson gave me more than his ring that night. He gave me permission to grieve publicly. He showed me that my son's death wasn't something to hide or minimize or turn into a funny story to make people comfortable. It was the most important thing that ever happened to me, and I could talk about it openly. That changed my life." The wedding ring ended up in the Smithsonian alongside the blue jacket from the other story. But its placement was different. It wasn't in the Johnny Carson exhibit. It was in the exhibit about grief in America. The card beside it simply read, "The moment a stranger became a witness to unbearable loss." 20 years after that episode, a man walked into the offices of a grief counseling center in Los Angeles. He told the receptionist he was starting a foundation for families who'd lost children to accidents. He said it was inspired by something he'd seen on television decades earlier. He wanted to create spaces where grief could be shared, where people didn't have to suffer alone. That man was Danny's oldest son, the one he'd had with his current wife, the one who'd heard all the stories about his half-brother Michael, the one who'd grown up knowing that his existence was connected to that loss, that he was part of a family that had learned how to carry grief together instead of separately. The foundation is still operating. It's helped thousands of families. It started because of one moment on The Tonight Show when a man in his 50s decided that professional protocol mattered less than human connection. But the real power of this story, the thing that people who watched it never forgot, was simpler than that. It was this: you are allowed to be broken. You are allowed to speak your pain. And there will be people who will sit with you while you do. You don't have to hide it. You don't have to make it funny. You don't have to make it comfortable for anyone else. You just have to be willing to let someone see you. Subscribe now, because the most important thing about this story is what Danny did after the episode aired. He made a choice that most grieving people would never make, and it changed not just his life, but the entire trajectory of how his family would understand loss. That decision is coming up, and it's the moment that proves this whole story is really about resilience and rebuilding. What made Johnny Carson's greatest contribution to television wasn't the jokes or the monologues or the interviews with celebrities. It was moments like this one. It was choosing presence over performance, even when the entire machinery of television was built to push him toward entertainment instead. The Smithsonian display has a note beneath the wedding ring. It says, "On this night in 1982, a talk show host and a grieving father taught America that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop trying to make people feel better and just help them feel seen." 23 years of The Tonight Show, 5,276 episodes, thousands of celebrities, thousands of jokes, thousands of moments designed to entertain. But this is the one people still talk about. Not because it was funny, because it was true.